Hey, everybody. Special treat today, a special treat. And we've done this a few times on the show, and we're doing it again because it was such a success. No pressure, you two. I have two guests on today, and I from getting to know them a little bit before we press record, I feel like there's some hive mind going on, but there's also some like quite differences, which probably makes you great business partners. So we're going to talk first. So first we have Leigh Marz. She's a collaboration consultant and a leadership coach, and she is a student of ritualized use of psychedelic medicines in the West. And we were just talking about some good news if you're into that stuff in Colorado last week with the election cycle, because we're recording this the week after the elections. We also have Talbot Zorn, who is a former policymaker and definitely a first time on the show, meditation teacher in U.S. Congress. He is an expert and specialist on economics and the psychology of well-being. Welcome, you two. So good to have you here.
Thanks for having us, Jason.
Really good to be with you, Jason. Thank you.
Awesome. So good to have you too. We were just talking about, to let get everybody listening know a little behind the curtains here about how fun it is and how different it is a host when you have two people, because some of the questions I ask, you're not going to have the same answers. So we're going to have a great time today. We're going to improv this. So first of all, two of you, and the other thing I didn't mention is you two are co-authors about a very specific topic, which we are going to spend a lot of time on, which I'm a big believer in, and is also very ironic that we're on a format where we're going to be doing a lot of talking, but we'll also be doing some listening. So first of all, you two, what is something that each of you nerds out about?
Well, I think, Jason, it's only appropriate that we tell you a little bit about the nerding out that we've done on this topic. We wrote this book about Golden, The Power of Silence in a World of Noise. And it's a book about why the world is so noisy these days and why the answer to so many of the problems we're facing might not come through more thinking or talking, why the answers might be in the silence.
We've been nerding out about this for now 5 years. And what I like about your question here about nerding out is we would never say we're experts in this, but we definitely nerd out in silence. And the way we love to do that is by having these conversations with all sorts of people, neuroscientists, artists, politicians, a man incarcerated on death row, whirling dervish, lieutenant Air Force colonel, just all sorts of people who are devotees of silence. And we love to ask them this question: what's the deepest silence you've ever known? And then nerd out on their answers. Yeah. That's what this book is, I suppose. I hadn't thought about it. It's just a big old nerding out on silence.
And now you've done what I'm sure you do to everybody when you ask that question, and I'm like, oh my gosh, what's my answer to that?
We would love to know your answer.
Well, we might get into a section later in the podcast where you can ask me anything you want. So
okay,
maybe we've got a preview. That's good.
Right,
Start marinating on the question, Jason.
Yeah.
Oh, man. Well, I'm going to be present with the questions for you all, and I will definitely be marinating on it. I'm really curious as what led you to this? Like, what led you to the study of this? This is for either of you or both of you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Jason, you mentioned a little bit about my background working in the U.S. Congress. Leigh's been working with scientists around the world on taking toxic chemicals out of supply chains, working on domestic violence, lots of other really serious issues. And for us, we came to writing about this because of a feeling of being despondent, for lack of a better word, about the state of the world. Like, what are we going to do about this crazy world? And we both meditated on this question as activists and advocates and parents of young kids. And we both came to this really simple intuition that the answers to the big problems humanity's facing might not come through more data, through more thinking, more talking. The answers might be in the silence. And not just the everyday moments of silence, although that's important, but listening as deeply to the silence as we possibly can, getting as far as we can beyond all the clutter, beyond all the auditory distraction, but also all the informational inputs. And if we can, beyond the internal noise that's going on in each of our own heads. And this isn't to say that we had this intuition that we should all run away to monasteries, but just this intuition that we should start to value silence, look for answers in pristine attention. So we wrote an article about this idea for Harvard Business Review. The article did really well. It was one of their most shared articles over a 2-year period. And then we took that as a signal to keep going with this. And as Leigh just mentioned, we started asking this really unusually diverse mix of people this question: what's the deepest silence you've ever known?
Wow. Amazing. Leigh, anything to add to that one?
Just that there was a bit of a journey there, starting with auditory noise, which Justin just hit upon, that we were looking at really that decibel levels and how noise and sound and silence lives in our ears. But through these conversations, we were really pointed more and more towards the informational world, that is, which coming through a lot of times through our screens, right? Things that are grabbing more and more aggressively all the time for our attention. And that is definitely a modern day conundrum we find ourselves in. And then again, through these conversations, we were also being directed towards that internal experience that have of quiet or of noise, of internal chatter. So we look at those 3 levels. That's the framework we took on: auditory, informational, and internal, looking at decibel levels, looking at bits of information, which is what grabs for our attention. And then looking at the internal chatter, rumination, worry about the future, and fretting about the past that goes on. A professor at University of Michigan, Ethan Cross, estimates we listen to something like 320 State of the Union addresses of compressed speech internally on any given day. So all of these, the auditory landscape, the informational grabbing for our attention landscape, and how aggressive that's gotten with our digital landscape in particular, and then the internal landscape, they're all exponentially louder than they've ever been. And so silence feels like, things have swung so much towards noise that silence is where we got interested in how we could perhaps cut through that noise so that we can really discern the signals that need our attention, because there are some things inside that noise that needs our attention. Yeah. And what's the best use of our time, our purpose for being here, and how to be most effective in our work and in our families and in our lives.
All right. One of the great parts about, all right. No, I'm now I'm going to get really, I'm going to get some, one of the great things about being a podcast host, not a ghost. Well, maybe sometimes a ghost, but is getting to get gold from my guests. So I am also a parent of young children. Silence, listening, and quiet is not what I would describe is the norm most of the time. And we have a 6-year-old who can understand this. And then we have a little guy who just turned 2. We're not going to have this conversation quite yet, but what does your research show? Like, what do you say to parents of children or even children? And I ask this from the lens of, this doesn't seem to be something that gets talked about in the education system, at least in elementary school, junior high, and high school. I don't remember it, but I'm just curious, like, what would you say to parents? And they're like, hey, my kids don't seem to want to listen. And I'm not talking about behavioral listening. I'm just talking about they don't know how to listen to themselves. What would you say to that?
Justin, you want to start us off?
Sure. I'm really glad you raised this, because we do look at the work of finding silence in the home with young kids in the book. Because as I mentioned, this isn't about like running away to a monastery and finding that monastic kind of extreme silence. It's about everyday silence, how to notice noise and tune into silence, including with young kids. So one practice we look at, for example, is at dinner time, can you ask questions to your young kids? Like, what are we grateful for? What's a choice that we've made recently that's led to a good outcome? How have we failed recently? What have we given to others recently? And then leave space after the questions. Like, get comfortable asking a question and saying, let's just be quiet with the question for a little bit. Another thing we work with a lot I have 2-year-old twins and also a 6-year-old. So I'm with that age.
So you know what I'm talking about.
That same set of ages, it's like, we live out in the mountains, Santa Fe, New Mexico. I know, Jason, you're in the Catskills in the mountains as well. So one thing we like to do is, going out for walks in a wooded area, listening, just saying, whoa, do you hear the sound of the breeze in the branches? Sometimes I joke that I talk too much, even having written about this book when we're out on hikes, and my when we're out on hikes, my 6-year-old will say, Daddy, you got to stop talking. We're on the walk because we're going to go looking for fairy houses. And if you talk too much, they're not going to be able to show themselves. So sometimes they're my teacher in terms of finding silence. But, I would say with young kids, as with all of us, being open to the silence is being open to the sense of wonder, being open to inspiration when it'll strike, when it'll appear. And we can get into the science of why that's so. We could talk about that a little bit too. But it's just about feeling into this mostly.
Yeah. It seems so important to remind ourselves that really the children can be our teachers when it comes to silence. A lot of us really know a deep, immersive, rapturous silence from our childhood, potentially. For me, that was playing out deep in the woods in sort of the swampy area and just being quiet for hours and watching little, insects fly around, little water striders and all kinds of things, crane fly larvae and all these things. So sometimes our relationship to silence, that deepest silence we've ever known, may come from our childhood wisdom. And I love, Justin, that you reminded us of how kids can remind us to be quiet. I mean, some children really, really know their way. They haven't really learned to bombard themselves with noise in the way that we do now. It was actually my now teenage daughter who suggested that we hold a day of silence when we were out on this far, deep wilderness rafting trip in Alaska on the Tatsunshini and Alsek River. She said, let's just be silent for a day, Mom. And, because I was kind of feeling frustrated with the amount of chatter. So she shared it was her idea, and we stayed silent for the day. And it was beautiful just to watch the clouds with her and just be side by side. And even as a teen, she and I, there's some times where it's just nicer to spend time not with all those words, right? Not hashing through all this to-do list and things, but just to be together in a shared presence. We find that silence is magnified when it's shared like that.
Oh, man, there's so much there. I was thinking as you two were talking about how for most of humanity, silence has been mostly how people work, especially agricultural societies. You go out in the field and you work and you're not right next to somebody generally. And you generally would spend all day doing that. And then you would come back and connect with other people, a family and such. But most jobs in at least in the information sector, it's mostly about communicating all the time. And one of the things, I know that you both do some coaching and obviously politics, this is the thing, listening and really listening through the different levels and being quiet. I came from a sales background and I was taught to listen through a specific lens, right? Salespeople, you're generally trained to listen for what's the problem so that I can solve it. And being uncomfortable with even a little bit of silence, because the silence is where you provide value. It's where you convince people. It's where you persuade them. It's where you give them a whole bunch of data and information. And you see this in politics and debates and such, right? If there's too much silence in a debate, generally somebody will fill that with more information. And it's only through in the last probably 4 years that I've even become comfortable with, and I'm talking about tangible silence, like sitting, hey, let me ask you two a question. If you didn't answer, I would sit here and just stare at you. Didn't used to be that way. It's just absolutely fascinating. So Justin, you mentioned the science of this. I would love to get in, because I know you two have done a lot of studying on this, like the scientific approach. I'd love to hear, what does the science tell us about this? And my second question, which I usually don't like to stack questions, but just to frame this up for you is this a new field? Is this generally a new area of study this is a higher ed, seems like a higher ed kind of topic. But so question number one is, what does the science tell us? And number two, is this a newer area of study? And whoever would like to take those answers, or
you want to take one and
please.
I'll take two, Justin?
Sure. I can start us off. It is a new area of study. It's historically been of little interest to most researchers, silence. And as we mentioned, we look at silence at 3 levels: the auditory level, the informational level, and the internal level. We look at the noise in our ears, the noise on our screens, and the noise in our heads. But some research about 20 years ago in Italy first looked at the impact of noise on the cardiovascular system and found that it was pretty serious. It was pretty substantial. And that helped to start a kind of movement within medicine and the physical sciences of taking silence more seriously. But it's really not a brand new area of study, because in the 1850s, Florence Nightingale, the famous British nurse, actually regarded noise and silence as one of the most important things that healthcare practitioners should be thinking about. She was in charge of a hospital during the Crimean War, a British Army hospital, and the hospital was in awful conditions. I mean, gangrenous wounds were going unattended, basic hygienic standards being ignored. And amidst all of that, she took on noise as a top-tier concern. And that was because she recognized that noise drove the fight-or-flight response, which she, even all that time ago, the 1850s, could recognize that fight-or-flight response, the palpitations and sweat and fatigue that would cause, was a hindrance to healing. So that's what modern medicine's been showing for many decades now. Neuroscience and medicine and psychology has been revealing that what Florence Nightingale intuited was correct. So in the book, we look at the science of why that's so, why too much unwanted noise, unwanted distraction, unwanted interference with our attention drives stress through the amygdala in the brain.
Oh.
Leigh, you want to talk a little bit more about some of the other levels to the science of silence?
Absolutely. So what Justin's pointing to is how silence was primarily treated as a control variable, sort of a neutral, a nothing, as opposed to the area of interest. And so Irmke Christie and her team at Duke Medical University actually took silence more into account in this study, looking at mammalian brains' response to silence, to pup sounds. This is little mice pups, to some classical music and a few other stimulus surrounding things. And it was silence that showed the most sustained neural growth in the brain, in the area of the hippocampus associated with memory and things like this. So that was in about 2011, and that turned a lot of interest towards silence, that auditory type. In our book, we're looking again at all those different levels. So we turned to some neuroscientists to ask especially about the internal silence that we're interested in. This is a great area of mystery and discovery, I think, right now. So, because what is silence in the mind? And we asked a range of neuroscientists that question, and psychologists that question, and they agreed it is very much an experience, a mental state, one that they were familiar with. But a quiet brain would be, in a word, dead. So the brain is always firing and active, but there is an experience of being internally, pristinely quiet. And no doubt you and your listeners will recognize something. So in this case, we're not looking, for example, someone might think automatically, oh, you're talking about meditation. But for many of us, we sit to meditate and things get extremely loud inside. And even though we're both we're both past meditators, lapsed meditators, we joke, but so we're really interested in what are the things, the activities or the non-activities that create a sense of internal quiet. Those might be flow states, for example, those that were explored first, most broadly by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. So looking at active flow states, but also micro flow states, which could be like doodling and reading and other things as well. So, and then moments of awe where we are just completely captivated by, say, what's before us and our own awareness of ourselves, our egoic selves, sort of falls away. We feel both a sense of diminishment, that sense of self falls away, but maybe connected to that thing which we're in awe of, a deep connection with that beautiful landscape that we are also a part of. So there's this umbrella term for self-transcendent experiences, which encompass flow states, encompass moments of awe, encompass mystical experiences, mental states sometimes brought about by meditation, sometimes brought about by psychedelic and expanded states of consciousness. So just this great big umbrella term. So that is a very new, and if you ask us, exciting area of study that is emerging Yeah. And so they're looking at what's happening in the brain. Is it about something happening or not happening in the prefrontal cortex? There's some debate over that. Is it about attentional networks firing in a synchronized manner? Is it the default mode network deregulating? And, there's a lot of different studies going on, which psychedelics are helping with, because it's one of those cases where you can, a mystical experience happens spontaneously, without machinery on you. But we could give you, a little bit of psilocybin, put you in an fMRI and study what's going on in the brain and things like that. And meditators as well. All these studies with meditators is also helping us understand what's happening in the brain when it's quiet.
Oh, thanks, you too.
Yeah.
I like to always come with some actionable things for people that are listening to do as well. Anybody's listening out there, and I'm speaking for myself here too, they go, I get it. This sounds really valuable. And God, I'm in a job that doesn't, I'm in a job where I'm pounded by either clients or that I've got kids at home. I live in New York City, right? Like, talk about noise. How can people start to practice this? You mentioned meditation as one avenue, but people are like, hey, I'd like to just practice being more quiet. And what I hear here is the silence is access to presence.
Mm-hmm.
So if somebody's like, I would, Justin, Leigh, I really want to start practicing this, I just don't know where to start, what would you recommend?
We think of this book, Jason, as a non-meditator's guide to getting beyond the noise. We don't want to think about, we didn't want to think about writing a book that just goes and tells people to meditate. There's 1,000 books.
There's a few of those out there.
There's a few of those out there. What we wanted to write this book was simply about cultivating appreciation for silence. There's an aesthetic principle, a philosophical principle from ancient Japan called Ma, which is the appreciation of the space in between. The space between the words we speak, the space between the notes in music, even the empty space in ikebana flower arranging and in ancient art. And this word Ma is the character for sunlight coming through the gate in a temple, on the outside of a temple. And a meaning of Ma is pure potentiality. So our hope with this book is to help people appreciate pure potentiality, to help appreciate Ma, however that manifests. And for us, this is the way to start practicing, just appreciating the spaces in between. So when you have a little moment in between emails you have to write at the office or things you have to take care of and work, rather than immediately filling that space with a phone or immediately filling that with the stimulus of sound, sound or some kind of content, can you take a moment and take a deep breath and just appreciate the silence? How deeply can you go into the silence, even if it's only for 5 seconds? If you're with your kids and they happen to be satisfied with some toys or something for just 10 seconds, can you go as deeply as you can and focus not so much on the quantity of the silence, but the quality? And Leigh mentioned before that medical study at Duke University where the researchers found that the act of listening to nothing actually amplifies the growth of brain cells, neurons in the auditory cortex. So can you take some time, say you have a few minutes to spare, rather than necessarily having to go and get your bell and cushion and do a formal sitting meditation practice, can you just go and listen to nothing?
The main character in this book, really the soul of this book, one of the main teachers that we connected with, is a man incarcerated on death row for a crime he didn't commit. The preponderance of evidence is that he didn't commit it, and we certainly believe that to be true. He's been on death row for 32 years now. Jarvis J. Masters is his name. He's an accomplished Buddhist teacher, found Tibetan Buddhism while in San Quentin on death row. And here he is in this environment where he's 23 hours out of a day in a cell, a 4x9 cell. He has very little control over most anything he does in a day, but he would argue he has a lot of control over his response to the noise. And the environment of San Quentin is cacophonous. It is so loud with cement and metal and keys and yelling, hollering, and just constant conversing and rants and things like this day and night. So he's had to find a way to quiet his response to the noise in order to keep his equilibrium, keep his sanity, especially with these set of circumstances. So he's our teacher there. He speaks to us about a sphere of control, that which he can control, which his responses are one of those things, that which is within his sphere of influence. And over time, with all these relationships he's had with different men on the tier, they even protect his writing time. He's written 2 books, one which, by the way, was just picked by Oprah in her book club, That Bird Has My Wings. So he's written 2 books in prison using just the filler of a pen to write them. So he's had to find extraordinary concentration to keep his sanity, to write and focus on things like that in that environment. So if he can do it, we can do it out here, even in the middle of New York with however many kids and, very stressful job is what we would argue, which is why he comes in with great compassion to show us the way. Yeah.
Before we go to the commercial break here, this reminds me of the Viktor Frankl quote that and I'm going to rest in peace, Victor. It's between the stimulus and the sponsor, the space between those two is when you have a choice, and that's where all the growth happens. And that's also so brilliant about the prison, because without ever being in prison, I've seen plenty of movies and television shows. It does not look like a very quiet place most of the time. Wow, it's amazing.
It is not. We love that quote. Yeah, we love it.
We love that quote, and that space is our power to choose our response, and in our response lies our growth and our freedom. And it's such a, to what Leigh was just saying about our teacher, Jarvis J. Masters, one of the key stories in this book. It's such an ironic thing these days, Jason, that the freedom can be in the silence. Because we usually think of freedom of speech, freedom to say whatever you want on Twitter, freedom to fill our days with, as much sound and stimulus and entertainment as possible. But what's real freedom? It's what is really the circumstance, the condition that gives rise to real choice? And for us, that requires an ability to tune into profound silence.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Speaking of silence, we're all going to get a break for a quick second. It's not going to be silent because we're going to have a quick commercial, and we'll be right back after this.
The Talking to Cool People podcast is brought to you by Jason Frizzell Coaching. Jason works with amazing people who are looking to find and develop their passion and purpose and create their journey to wherever it is they want to go. Check us out at jasonfrizzell.com, Facebook, or on Instagram. Jason loves hearing from anyone who thinks it would be cool to connect, to be coached, or to be a guest on our show. Email him at podcast@jasonfrizzell.com or DM him on Facebook and Instagram. And now, back to some more amazing conversation on Talking to Cool People.
All right, you two, we are back. And now I think we're just going to sit here for 20 minutes and people are going to listen to us in silence. How does that sound?
No, we would love that. We would love it.
You two would love that. And people listen to me wait, what? I don't need to be on this podcast anymore because they're going to sit here in silence.
Right.
So we are going to continue to talk, although maybe next time you come on, we will have some sort of silence practice and ask the audience to do it with us. That could be pretty cool.
Yeah.
So, I mentioned this before, that one of the things I like to do on this show is to have my guests ask me something. Some of my guests are good friends, some are acquaintances, and some are people like you two that we show up on a meeting together and go, hey, this seems like it's going to be a fun conversation. So we've never met until basically when we pressed record. So I'm curious what you two would like to ask me. And maybe I can be an additional data point in all the research you've done since we just met. What would you two like to ask me?
Oh,
I'm wondering, Leigh, do you want to read the opening prompt in the book?
Okay.
Ooh, that sounds amazing.
I'm thinking, Jason, we can. It's quick, but it's a question.
Yeah, let's do it. Great.
It's a question, but Leigh's going to guide you in a little bit of a meditation, I would say.
Yeah.
And you can tell us what comes to mind. I mean, sit with it for a moment and see where it brings you.
Yeah.
This is working out even better than expected. I didn't, just to be clear to everybody listening, I had no idea that you had a prompt at the beginning of the book because I haven't read it yet. So amazing. I am all yours. Let's do it.
Okay. Chapter 1, an invitation. What's the deepest silence you've ever known? You can trust the first memory that comes to you. No need to overthink it. As you recall the experience, see if you can settle into it. Recall where you are, what's happening around you, and who, if anyone, is present. See if you can summon the atmosphere, the quality of light, the mood in the air, the feeling in your body. Is it quiet to the ears? Or is it the kind of silence that comes when no person or thing is laying claim on your attention? Is it quiet in your nerves? Or is it the kind of silence that lives deeper still, like when the turbulent waters of internal chatter suddenly part, revealing a clear path forward? Take a moment to consider what might sound like a strange question. Is the silence simply the absence of noise? Or is it also a presence unto itself?
I'm assuming you've done some voice work for meditation apps before or something.
Oh, that's sweet of you.
that was excellent. Well, I'm going to be totally honest and tell you what came up for me because we're just being honest here. Yeah. And this is interesting. It's probably going to be a really unexpected answer. So when you said the deepest, where my mind went was the earliest, and I don't know why, but I'm just being honest. And I had pretty bad night terrors when I was a little kid. And one of my night terrors, it's actually one of my earliest memories. I was probably 4 or 5. And for those who don't know what a night terror is, it's when children really only have them. I don't know if your children had them. We've been fortunate, ours have not. It's where the child is not fully asleep, but when it's like a nightmare, but they're kind of awake, but you can't wake them up. It's actually quite scary the first time it happens for a parent. It's called a night terror. So it's kind of like a nightmare, but the child is like half conscious. But what I remember as you were saying that, Leigh, was what came to me. I'd have these night terrors where I was in the dark and I would these hard surfaces, but I remember screaming for my parents, but it was quiet. So again, if I can do some therapy work here, but like what came to me as like the first memory and maybe like the quietest was that I was there and I was helpless as a little child and I was scared, but I couldn't ask for help. And so it was almost like a horror movie, but completely quiet. So that's like the first thing that came up. But then the next thing that came up for me was when you say silence, the way I interpret that is I don't, and again, you can both tell me if you define silence as actually the absence of noise. The way I define, like where I live, and we mentioned I live in the Catskills, we live in the country. I like to walk in the morning with no podcast or music and kind of listen to, like, it's obviously the fall now. I kind of listen to the wind and the trees and my feet, but I kind of like try not to and just get present. And so for me, that's kind of my version of silence. And that's a new practice for me. Anybody who knows me, I'm 100% extroverted. I'm an external processor, go-getter, high energy. Silence is not one way that people would describe me, nor having access to it. So it's a great question. And I started this 2 years ago when we moved. It'd be like, hey, like, let's see what it would be like to just walk without the stimulation of anything besides just walking and maybe having my dog with me. Right. Like, and as a parent of 2 young children that I live with all the time, silence, like actual absence of noise, is almost non-existent until they go to bed. So that's what came up for me in that meditation. That was really powerful because I was like, I closed, for everybody listening, I closed my eyes. I really got present to it. And now I'm just really curious about that thing with my childhood. Like that's what related to. It's crazy.
Jason, thank you so much for sharing that. There's so much like just richness in the answer you just gave, and a couple things we'd love to share, just reflect back on.
Please.
Because, we have a chapter in the book called Why Silence is Scary. And why, at the super mundane levels, like everyday awkward silence, all the way to the terror of facing the abyss of nothingness. It sounds like as you were describing, but I want to first just touch on a few things that you got into there, which is what is silence? What does this actually mean? And you said silence, is the absence of noise, is one way to think of it. And we agree, at one level, silence is the absence of noise. And the way we think of it is, it's the space where no one is making claims on your consciousness. It's the space where nothing is interfering with your perception and your intention. So some people talked about silence, the deepest silence they've ever known, as, running the perfect line through roaring rapids in a river, which can be super high decibel, but there's nothing interfering with the perception or intention. One of the big surprises for us was sometimes when we asked that question, what's the deepest silence you've ever known? People told us something about the 4 a.m. mark at an all-night dance party. And it's the same thing, nothing interfering with your perception and your intention. Because it might be super high decibel, but you are in it and you are in pristine attention. So we look at this way that, yes, silence is the absence of noise. But as Leigh alluded to in the little guided meditation, silence is also a presence unto itself. There's a level of silence where it is a presence, and it's a stance of not knowing, not having to have the answer, accepting it's okay to not fill the space, that it's good to just be.
Yeah.
So we look at this kind of silence as a kind of state of wholeness, at the sound and stimulus. The point of it all is to signal, well, what needs to be done? What needs to change? Then the pristine attention, that pure awareness, the pure silence is wholeness. It's a space where nothing needs to be done. And it's an interesting commentary on human nature that sometimes that is scary for us.
Yeah. Well, I have to say before, Leigh, I know you have something here. I feel very validated that me listening to Leaves and Wind would count when some people say 4 a.m. at a club. I'm like, cool. I'm like, oh, so my answer isn't totally wacky.
Definitely not. I mean, in fact, we were speaking with a professor of biobehavioral health and medicine, Joshua Smythe, who, when we asked him about this internal silence, that experience of not having claims on your consciousness, on your attention, he reminded us that silence is, or quiet is, what we think it is. What quiet is, what we experience it to be. So for you to be walking your dog through the forest and listening to the leaves, I mean, that is definitely, sounds of nature is very quietening for many of us. And then, but then there's a big range. In fact, a gentleman in one of his studies, he does these huge mindfulness stress reduction studies. A gentleman in his studies, I've never called him a gentleman before, but you'll like this. What he does is in his free time is use a chainsaw to carve big hunks of wood. That's his art form, his joy and his flow state. And it's loud, right? And me, I'm a dance teacher. I'm in a thumping loud studio, but I'm completely losing myself in the best way and connecting with all the people there in this kind of large organism of shared space and that kind of collective flow state. That's my quiet in a loud studio environment. Yeah. So we point the readers and your listeners to really getting honest with themselves about what really brings us quiet, that sense of quiet, not get too hung up on just the mere auditory definition, although that's a helpful thing to have the volume dial go down. It's definitely creating harm in our ears and in our nervous systems to be in these loud environments. But I also love that you brought out this range, how silence is scary, and why, of course, it would be silent. Silence could be understandably scary in different ways with that kind of background that you describe. And thank you so much for naming that. And we all have different versions of that. And there's also the silence that is imposed sometimes for those of us who've had abusive experiences with silence, being closed-lip complacency, being stonewalled, being silenced, feeling silence. So, silence is a complex topic, but we argue in this book that type of silence, of closed-lip complacency and that's being oppressed, is actually born of the world of noise, that it's ignoring that true, clear intention and connection when we silence others.
Yeah. Thanks, Leigh. To wrap up for today, I would love to hear, again, what's great about being a podcast host is I just get to ask whatever I want.
I know.
I'm so curious about how you two got connected, how you found out that you had this shared, vision or interest in a topic that, like you said, is not a topic that's widely talked about. And then do you two remember the moment you're like, oh, we need to write a book? And I say that partially because I work with a lot of authors. I am not a writer myself, but I do branding work for authors. And I know it is no small feat to write a book. And I can only imagine writing a book with somebody else, especially when you maybe don't totally agree on how that is. So love to hear kind of your journey to how you two got connected, where you had like, hey, we have the shared interest in this topic. And then, hey, let's write a book. And then we'll wrap up and we'll talk more about the book as well. Yeah, I loved it. That's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in a lot of things, but for today, this is what I would love to hear from the two of you.
Thanks, Jason. It was really organic. My wife and I were making the move from DC to Santa Fe, New Mexico. We were just becoming parents, and I was trying to figure out a career change, moving from that world of politics to something that was a little bit more bridging my contemplative work and interest to my work in writing and policy. And a dear friend, Sarah Mitchell, who's also friends with Leigh, said, you got to meet my friend Leigh, who's, kind of the other side of the equation you're talking about. So we connected. She gave me some good advice. I asked if there was anything I was working on that'd be of interest to her that I could help her out with. And she suggested we do some writing. So we started exploring some ideas together.
Amazing.
But this was like so organic, so like seemingly random that we had some ideas of some things we wanted to write about for Harvard Business Review. And we sent the editor 5 different topics. 4 of them seemed very HBR style. The 5th one was the wild card, which was this intuition I mentioned before, how the answers to big problems might not come through more thinking or talking, the power of silence in decision making. The editor wrote back, send me a draft on silence. We did. And then, as I mentioned, it resonated with people. And because the article, did as well as it did, and some things about our background that we shared in there, like teaching meditation in Congress and some of the nature of Leigh's work, some people just started saying, you could get set up with a book deal here, and some agents were interested in us, and ended up taking it to publishers. And book went to auction, had about 7 publishing houses bid on it, and it's coming out in 14 languages now. So it was totally, it was not something we, not something we were planning out for sure.
Definitely not. I would just add that. Well, we do hear from people that writing a book with another person would seem to be challenging. For us, that's just not our experience. We really would never have written this book without the other. There's something that's created in our duo, that creates a trio that's bigger than both of us. And we just kept listening to what was being asked of us, how we were needing and wanting to show up and meet this time, initially that place of despondency, and then the success of the article that we spoke to, and then really just feeling our way, literally feeling with our instruments of our whole selves, feeling our way in our relationship with what the next step was for this. And it's been a real blessing. It has been phenomenal. So transformational. So some of that it's occurring to me that really had to do with us stepping out of the relating to silence, and even this challenge of writing a book. We had to step away from the concept of silence and the concept of writing a book and all that is, and really got into the experience of what is silence and what are we really experiencing as silence, the felt experience of silence. We encourage your listeners and our readers to do the same, to not just think about silence or even think about what it's like to write with another person. Try it, do it, get that into the felt experience of that. Because there's a big distance between those things, the concept and the reality. So,
I'm
thank
curious
you for
for
that
both
question.
Yeah. And I was over here like, what do I want to know before I lose you and the audience loses you? For this time around, we'll definitely have you come back on. And there's so much gold here.
You'll never lose us, Jason. You'll never lose us.
You're now. Okay. So each week
here for you.
You're here for me. And wouldn't that be ironic for like, we're going to have the people who love silence back on to talk more.
Again and again and again.
Nonstop. I had a process question. I was like, like I said, I know a lot of authors. I have quite a few authors on the show. I'm curious, did you both write the book or did you do it through like more like Audible where you speak? Like what are you both like writers, like sit down and fingers on keyboard or pen to paper kind of style authors?
Yeah.
Because you were a policy writer. So you were writing, Justin, you come from like a policy, and Leigh, do you come from a writing background as well?
We both have had a lot of writing in our jobs before. Justin had a lot more experience writing article pieces. I mean, lots and lots and lots of Justin is a born writer, and and
that helps too.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, but we wrote this together. We wrote it through Google Docs. Thank you, Google Docs. Yeah,
exactly.
And Leigh is so much more organized than I am, and so much of writing a book is an organizational process. Because we did dozens of interviews with all sorts of people. And a big part of it was, charting out where do those interviews go? What are the narrative lines? What are the through lines here? Because it wasn't always as we expected. I mean, sometimes we talked to a neuroscientist who would tell us something that was super spiritual. And sometimes we'd talk to a spiritual teacher who would tell us something about science. So we would have to really be, detectives for, what each of these interviews was bringing to us, really pay careful attention. And Leigh just did a masterful job with, figuring out how to organize all these moving pieces. And we worked together on figuring out the storylines and then how to divide the chapters and then, working together to put it to words.
Yeah. So cool. I'm thinking, I have this funny saying is like, I will never write a book. And I have a friend who's like, yeah, that means you're going to write a book.
Right. Look out.
I always go, ugh. We're speaking as like coaching and breakthroughs. Doing a podcast is not a breakthrough for me. Sitting down and writing a book. But maybe the key, as I'm picking up here, is to find a great co-author where we can actually play on their strengths. I think I'm more the Justin here. I'm like, let me just put some stuff out there. I need a Leigh who's going to go, so how does this all fit together?
So we highly recommend it. Yeah.
And I'm like I said, a complete people person, extrovert. So for me to do something like that as a team would be a lot more fun for me too. I don't generally like doing stuff by myself. So let's wrap up today and talk about the book. So both kind of any takeaways that you learned from writing a book, and then let's talk about where people can find it and maybe what's next for the two of you. And we'll call it an interview for today. And then next week we'll continue on to the conversation. Maybe not next week, but sometime soon. So yeah, like what's, tell us a little bit about the book and any lessons you learned from writing it together.
Yeah. So the book is really an exploration of this intuition that we described, why the answers might come through the silence. And we look at the science of silence. We look at the spirituality and philosophy of silence, looking to all different traditions around the world. And then the book presents a field guide to finding silence in a world of noise. Individual practices in the day-to-day, practices for once in a while, once a year, maybe once in a lifetime, how to find what we call rapturous silence. And then we go into shared practices, like your question, Jason, about with kids and families. We look at what it means to find silence in groups and families, friend groups, a lot about professional settings, how to work with silence in the office on a remote team, creative problem solving. And then the final part of the book we call a society that honors silence. And we look at what it would mean in public policy and law if we appreciated the empty space, if we appreciated not just all the sound and stimulus and data we could create, but if as a society we prioritized pristine attention. And as a culture, if we prioritized pristine attention. So that's the kind of arc of the book.
Yeah.
Leigh, you want to?
Yeah, there are just a few surprises in there I'll speak to. There were times where we thought, well, we'll just say this type of oppressive silence is not the kind of silence we're talking about, and we'll just shelve it and move on. But that ended up wanting and needing to be its own chapter. So we dive right into that. That takes us into some beautiful work about how silence is really connected to justice, the work of justice, that place of discernment for really what is true. So that was a beautiful exploration. So this is part of just that listening. If something just won't go away, it's like maybe it actually needs to be brought in more so. And then that piece about it being not just individual practices, but being relationships, really that our discovery, we learned about ourselves as I think mostly extroverts, if not full out extroverts, is that shared silence is of the most importance to us, especially as we are living our lives very much shared with a lot of people.
Yes.
So really exploring that, and we love taking that into the workplace and then really dreaming into a culture that honors silence. So you can find our book on Amazon and bookshop.org and all those places where you find books. As Justin mentioned, it's being translated into 14 foreign languages. It's out in Portuguese and in the UK. And what am I missing? There's one more that came. Oh, Italy. It's out in Italian already.
Nice.
So it's really fun seeing these covers and getting this experience. But I want to give a little shout out for the Audible book and the reader in particular, Prentice Oniyemi, assuming that some of your listeners are real auditory people. He's a brilliant reader that we were just so thrilled said yes to reading this book. And there's just something he does to our words that just brings in all this beautiful, buttery quiet from his voice. And it's just a delight. So the Audible book we highly recommend.
Nice.
And then you can find us at Astrea Strategies, which is where we do our combined work. That's ASTREA strategies.com. And we've got a bunch of media and podcasts and different things to listen to if you want to hear more from us. Yeah.
Thank you both for being on. This has been absolutely fascinating. I am going to put in all of that. We're going to put all that in the show notes and a link to the Harvard Business Review article. It sounds like that was a real nice catalyst for you. Man, I'm just thinking about how I can incorporate this. I can't wait to read the book. Last question for you. And what you say here does not hold you to it. Okay. You two have another book in you?
Huh.
They're both like,
boy. Maybe someday. It's part of
that says the guy with twin 2-year-olds.
Yeah, twin 2-year-old. Maybe wait till they're a little older. Leigh's brother has twins and gave me a bit of advice. He said when they're 2, it's like living in a fun house where it's all trick mirrors around you. And then when they're 3, it becomes like the Renaissance. You can think again. They start playing on their own. So I'm waiting on the Renaissance.
He's waiting for the Renaissance
books. But I am thinking it. I am feeling like when you ask that question, I'm feeling like everything about writing this book was so unexpected and just so natural. As I mentioned, kind of organic that I think I don't want to force it.
Yeah.
I don't want to push it.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah, it was so much a listening, and there's still so much to steward with this book that, we don't want to rush that either. It's like part of the responsibility of being, these co-parents of this book is to really let it have its time. But we will listen, and it won't be because it was too hard to co-write it. It would just be because it's just like, maybe that's not what's needed from us next. We'll see. Yeah.
Well, I also hear that it's not the thing you need to do. Like some people write a book, they're like, oh, and publisher, when it's successful, like you have, is like, what are you doing? When are you going to do in the next one? You're like, maybe not.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, Leigh and Justin, thank you so much for being on today. This was fascinating. I can't wait to have you come back on and we'll talk some more. We'll practice some silence. We'll talk. And it was just such a pleasure to get to know both of you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Jason.
That was great.
Take care.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Talking to Cool People with Jason Frizzell. If you enjoyed today's episode, please tell your friends. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook and give us a shout out or take a moment to leave a review on iTunes. If something from today's episode piqued your interest and you'd like to connect, email us at podcast@jasonfrizzell.com. We love hearing from our listeners because you're cool people too.